Welcome to our panel discussion entitled Reflections on the Taliban Takeover in Afghanistan. My name is Joseph Griffith. I am an assistant professor of politics here at the King's College. The King's College is a Christian liberal arts college in New York City's financial district. Through the interdisciplinary study of the great texts, we seek to inculcate the habits of living well and to prepare students for careers in which they help shape and eventually lead strategic and public and private institutions. Conversations on poignant topics like this are at the heart of what we do here at King's. Ask difficult questions and apply timeless truths to the particular exigencies of our moment in time. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists from the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked commercial airliners in order to attack America's key centers of economic, political, and military strength, resulting in the deaths of nearly 3,000 people. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in world history. 5 days later, US President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror. Our enemy, he said, is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. On October 7th, 2001, the United States deployed troops to Afghanistan in order to dismantle Al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban governments that harbored them. After 20 years, America's withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, just a little over a month ago, has raised a number of important questions that our panelists will seek to answer today. First, Dr. Robert Carle will speak on who are the Taliban. He is a professor of theology at the King's College and has written numerous articles on Islam and on the rise of Salafism in Europe. Next, Dr. Mary Habeck will speak on could we have won in Afghanistan? She is a strategic planner and an expert on military matters, Islam, and extremism, as well as the author of Knowing the Enemy, Jihadist Ideology and the War on Terror, published by Yale University Press. She received her PhD from Yale University and teaches at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Georgetown, and American University. Speaking on how should the exits have unfolded, Tim Gibson is president of the King's College and served for more than 30 years as a pilot in the United States Air Force, where he held extensive command responsibilities. He served as the installation commander of the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs and as the vice commander of the U.S. Air Force Expeditionary Center, Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst in New Jersey. In 2016, he retired from the Air Force in the rank of Brigadier General. Finally, Dr. Steele Brand will speak on reflecting on death, defeat, and disgrace. He is an associate professor of history at the King's College, where he writes about Republican warfighting and teaches courses on the ancient Mediterranean and medieval Europe. He served in the US Army from 2008 to 2013, deploying in Afghanistan's Nangarhar province in 2012 as a tactical intelligence officer. Brand was a cavalry squadron targeting officer. He provided daily briefings on the area of operations, identified who the high-value enemy targets were, and then recommended how to remove them from the battlefield. Each of our four panelists will speak, and then we will conclude with a Q&A session, a question and answer session. With that brief introduction, let me hand over the microphone to my colleague, Dr. Robert Carle.
Thank you, Dr. Griffith. Who are the Taliban? The Taliban are not traditionalist Afghani Muslims. Traditionalist Afghani Islam is a low-intensity, tolerant Sufi brand of Islam that is more mystical than dogmatic. The Taliban are students who've graduated from Deobandi madrasas, Deobandi boarding schools. And Deobandi Islam is dogmatic, rigid, intolerant, violent, and it's alien to Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Americans, Saudis, and Pakistanis were determined to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan, to make Russians bleed. And to this end, the Pakistanis and the Saudis funded the development of a huge network, thousands actually, of Deobandi madrasas in Afghan refugee camps along the Pakistani border. This suited American purposes quite well because these talibs made very good foot soldiers in our efforts to defeat the Soviet Union. During the 1980s, Osama bin Laden moved to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Osama bin Laden began his career as an anti-communist jihadi. Osama bin Laden was the son of a billionaire Saudi construction magnate, one of the richest men in the world. And bin Laden, with American and Saudi support, he brought bulldozers, loaders, dump trucks, trenching machines, and skilled engineers to build huge caves in the mountains of Afghanistan. Some of these caves are more than 100 yards long and 20 feet high, and they serve as air raid shelters, dormitories, hospitals, and ammunition dumps. Bin Laden and his group of Arab volunteers fought alongside the Talibs to defeat the Soviets. In 1989, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was in ruins. When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, the United States also lost interest in Afghanistan. We did not stick around to help rebuild Afghanistan. We thought our job was done. In 1991, Afghanistan descended into a civil war, and in 1994, the Taliban seized power. This Taliban were the most organized group of people. They were very fierce fighters. They had American weapons. They knew how to use them. And for these reasons, they came up on top in the Civil War. The Taliban in 1994 set up a pariah state in Afghanistan that shocked the world with its brutality. Women were practically lived under house arrest. They were prohibited from working or from going to school. There were brutal public beatings and executions. And most probably the Taliban are best known for blowing up 200-foot Buddhas of Bamiyan. They considered these Buddhas to be idols. These were cultural treasures that were built in the 6th century, and they blew up these Buddhas. Osama bin Laden returned to Afghanistan when the Taliban took power, and he turned his ire on the United States. Having defeated one great Satan, the Soviet Union, he now sought to defeat the other great Satan from his base in Afghanistan. The Taliban sheltered bin Laden as he built out his organization Al-Qaeda and launched attacks on the United States. Al-Qaeda bombed the US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, destroying the embassies. He also attacked the Navy vessel USS Cole as it was refueling in Yemen. He did this in the 1990s. Bill Clinton, with his over-the-horizon capabilities, lobbed missiles into Afghanistan. He killed a lot of civilians, did not hurt Al-Qaeda. Bill Clinton also lobbed a missile into the Sudan and destroyed a pharmaceutical factory, which he mistakenly thought was an armaments factory. In 2001, Al-Qaeda successfully attacked the World Trade Center in the Pentagon, killing 3,000 civilians. 15 out of the 19 hijackers in the World Trade Center attacks were Saudi Arabian nationals. In 2001, America demanded that the Taliban turn over Osama bin Laden to US authorities. The Taliban refused, and the US invaded Afghanistan in October 2001. And in December 2001, the government in Kandahar disintegrated. This was a war of necessity. It was not a war of choice. This is a war we needed to fight, and it's a war we needed to win. But from the very beginning, America's commitment to Afghanistan was quite anemic. Our leaders anticipated a quick and easy victory. Pakistan sensed our lack of resolve. And Pakistan, from the very beginning, played both sides of this conflict. The Pakistanis cannot afford to have a failed state on their border, and they can't afford to have another hostile state on their border. So they supported the US and they supported the Taliban both. A lot of Afghans played both sides. And this just prolonged the war and made victory impossible. And I'm just going to contrast our involvement in Afghanistan with our involvement on the Korean Peninsula. The US troops have been in South Korea since 1950. We currently have 28,000 troops in South Korea. South Korea was not a democracy until 1987. And I just think we can ask the question, what if the United States had pulled out in 1970? What if the United States had pulled out after 20 years on the Korean Peninsula? What would the Korean Peninsula be like? What would East Asia be like? Today, we are where we were in 2001. Around half of the Taliban's interim cabinet are listed on the UN Security Council's terrorism blacklist or on the US terrorism watch list. Al-Qaeda is now regrouping in Afghanistan, where it has the freedom to plan attacks on the West. I think that Al-Qaeda will probably be more successful in Europe than in the United States, because Europe has a large number of alienated, angry, ghettoized, unemployed Muslims. American Muslims, in contrast, tend to be integrated, employed, affluent, and educated. They don't make good terrorists. Students often ask me, what can I do? Well, what can I do in light of this situation? And my response is, you can welcome Afghan refugees into your neighborhoods and into your lives. If you do that, you will be fulfilling the gospel's command to love your neighbor, and you will also be making a contribution to our national security. On that note, I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Mary Habeck.
Thank you so much. Terrific talk. I have two questions that I'm hoping to raise, and then to give at least some answers about the situation in Afghanistan. The first question is that was actually raised by Dr. Carle is this a war that should have been won? And then secondly, a question that I have raised often in a lot of different contexts, is this a war that could have been won? So the first question, is this a war we should even have been involved in? Should we have taken 20 years to fight in this country? And was it worth it? My answer is, it really depends on who the enemy is. And as Dr. Carle pointed out, this is an enemy that chose in the form of Al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks in New York and Washington to begin a war with us. But what does this have to do with the Taliban? Aren't they just a local kind of group with only local ambitions to run Afghanistan? Actually, no, their form of Deobandi Islam was heavily influenced by Sahwa Salafism in their madrasas. And this form of Islam is not just about one country or one place. It actually has a global agenda. And we can tell this is true even in the 1990s, because Al-Qaeda was not the only group that was invited into Afghanistan to set up camps. In fact, they invited dozens of extremist groups in to set up training camps for guerrilla wars around the Muslim world. Especially North Africa, but all over the Muslim world. We have groups from as far away as Indonesia, Uyghurs, and Moroccans setting up groups in order to train for guerrilla warfare in their own countries. Al-Qaeda then was just one of these groups. And what they were doing was not beyond the control or, by the way, the agenda of the Taliban themselves. In fact, in 1998, bin Laden and Zawahiri, his deputy, were forced to swear an oath of fealty to Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, recognizing him as their boss. And this is an oath that al-Qaeda's leadership has renewed every time there's been a change of leadership of the Taliban. This means that we are not just dealing with a local group that happened to become kind of infested with a terrorist group carrying out attacks against us. We're dealing with a group out in the form of al-Qaeda that considered itself to be part of the Taliban. And the fact today that we have the second in command of the Taliban is in fact a high leading member of al-Qaeda, Sirajuddin Haqqani, suggests that this is not just rhetoric or some sort of temporary thing that's going on. In fact, the two are basically the same thing. So if the attacks that were carried out in 9/11 were not just about al-Qaeda, what were in fact about the Taliban / al-Qaeda, the entire war that was fought afterward was really about 9/11 and preventing another 9/11 from occurring. And this is why this war had to be fought, why it was a war of necessity. But could we have won this war? Was it possible for us to have won it? There's been a tremendous amount of work on this, lots of people writing different things, arguing different ways. One of the things that people point to is the reports by Sigar, the Inspectorate General that was sent to Afghanistan to carry out a set of interviews with commanders post deployment, during deployment, people who were knowledgeable about the situation on the ground and who talked in depth about their experience fighting this war. And if you read through those, very many of the people who are most knowledgeable about what happened boots on the ground would argue that this is a war that just could not have been won by the United States. There were too many factors that were beyond our control and over which we could do nothing. However, this does not take into consideration a whole set of political developments that were beyond the purview of the people who were deployed, boots on the ground in this country. And here I'd like to just say something briefly about this. When you're on the ground, boots on the ground, it's very, very easy to see what is going wrong around you, but very, very difficult to say why it's going wrong. And I would like to offer not an explanation that has to do with this particular incident or that particular incident, but an overall critique of the US engagement in Afghanistan. And that overall critique was a decision in 2009 to carry out a surge into Afghanistan that offered the commanders who were planning this surge half the troops they asked for and put a deadline on the deployment. This meant that the people who had just planned and carried out the successful surge in Iraq, and by the way, brief aside here, from the Abbottabad documents captured when bin Laden was killed, we know that al-Qaeda believes they lost the war in Iraq. Okay, so it was a successful surge, a successful counterinsurgency in Iraq. They believed that they could carry out the same successful strategy in Afghanistan, but they were given half the troops and only a year and a half or even less to actually carry it out, rather than the 8 to 10 years they acknowledged it would take to fight this war. And I'd just like to point out that 8 to 10 years from 2009 would mean 2019, this war, according to the commanders on the ground, could have been won. So why did this happen? A lot of it has to do with the fact that the Obama administration explicitly compared the war in Afghanistan to Vietnam, a flawed analogy that had nothing to do with the actual situation we were facing or the enemy that we were confronting. And this flawed analogy led them to believe that they were involved in an endless war that could not have been won. In fact, most military historians agree today that there was a chance to win the war in Vietnam, let alone the way that I think people will judge this war in Afghanistan. In addition, they believed that the Taliban could be separated from al-Qaeda, that these were two different things, that the Taliban were like they were in the 1990s, a group that they had dealt with, they had negotiated with, they'd worked with. Sure, they were terrible in their human rights and in a lot of things they had done to their own people, but they weren't a threat to their neighbors and certainly not a threat to the United States, ignoring the fact, of course, of this oath of fealty that al-Qaeda had made to the Taliban, and the fact that we also know from the Abbottabad documents that they discussed 9/11 with their boss, and he apparently approved. So this vision that we could kind of recreate the 1990s and work with the Taliban and get them to sort of extirpate al-Qaeda underlay a lot of their strategy of withdrawal from Afghanistan. They thought, like with Vietnam, we've overestimated the global challenge here, and we can work with these local actors. In addition, they didn't listen to their military because the military, somebody within the military, leaked the plan put together by General McChrystal to take on and defeat the Taliban, forcing their hand and forcing them to go into Afghanistan with this surge. Before this happened, they were in fact planning on simply withdrawing in 2009, perhaps 2010. But this forced their hand, and they believed that the military was out of control, that it was attempting to implement its own policy, and you shouldn't listen to their ideas about counterinsurgency. They'll always claim they can win, that there's a way forward, and that they need more troops and more time in order to make things go right. And the result was creation of a great deal of suspicion, if not outright hatred for the military, that expressed itself in the forced retirement of about 100 generals over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, including people like General Mattis. This meant that those who were left were given the impression that you better agree with your political leadership if you want to keep your job and if you want to keep your pension. And so a lot of the military leadership of the United States from about 2011, 2012 onward began to give only good news about what was happening in Afghanistan. Now, you might say this is a form of almost cowardice, but I'm not in their shoes and I'm not going to judge. But what we can say is the person who put them, or the people who put them in this position, were those who were threatening them. And it's those political policy people that I believe should be held more to blame for what happened in Afghanistan afterward. So my conclusion is we could have won if we had done the same thing that we had done in Iraq. It actually succeeded. There's no al-Qaeda in Iraq any longer, and there's no Saddam in charge of that country. In that sense, the United States achieved its two objectives for that war. We could have achieved our objectives for Afghanistan as well, not just ending the Taliban reign of terror over their own people, but destroying a chance for al-Qaeda to rebuild itself that it now has in its old safe haven. Thank you. And now I'd like to pass it off to President Gibson and his remarks. Thank you.
Dr. Habeck, thank you. Very much appreciate the insights from across the years of the engagement. So as Dr. Griffith mentioned during the introduction, I spent 32 years in the United States Air Force. And at various times, although I was trained as a pilot, I was also trained in some other capacities, most notably in the command and control arena. 2 years in particular of my career stood out in that. The first was a year that I spent at the Command and General Staff College with the United States Army in Fort Leavenworth, followed by a year at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, where I attended the School of Advanced Air Power Studies. And at the conclusion of that, essentially got a master's degree in operational war planning. It sounds like a very narrow and niche degree. It turns out to be a terribly applicable one in arenas that I didn't anticipate, which is tremendously helpful. Later in my career, in 2016 specifically, I had the opportunity to deploy to Qatar and the Combined Air Operations Center there as the Director of Mobility Forces. And in that capacity, my responsibility was to be the senior airlift and air refueling representative to the theater air commander. And it was my role to plan for and execute all airlift, passenger movement, airdrops, et cetera, throughout the entire Central Command area of operations, which would include Afghanistan. As part of that, I would be responsible for the airfields and the airfield readiness to perform those missions, to include the security element. And so I was in and out of a number of our major airfields throughout the theater, to include Kabul. Given that, and at the risk of being particularly technical for the next couple of minutes, what I'd like to do is walk through a little bit from a former Director of Mobility Forces perspective, how the exit out of Afghanistan could have, and I will argue should have, unfolded. So given that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration made it clear that a withdrawal from Afghanistan was desirable, and I don't think anybody, any American would disagree that was something that should at least be planned for. The military has a very structured military decision-making process, is the formal title. It's 7 major steps, but within each of those steps are dozens of subcategories, subtasks that would unfold, to all the way from getting the commander's intent and understanding that thoroughly, to making the assumptions that were necessary for planning to proceed. And so, given the fact that there was plenty of time and that the intent of the political leadership was clear, commanders on the ground and across the world, because the airlift community certainly is a global community, would have had plenty of time to look into and plan for how that withdrawal would have unfolded. Specifically, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes thinking about the assumptions. For any plan to proceed, assumptions often will need to be made, and that's normal. It's perfectly legitimate to do so. But along with those assumptions, planners are always tasked with finding a means of turning those assumptions into facts in a timely manner. That will often entail building out what is known as a collection plan. How do we know if that assumption is valid? What do we need to look at and monitor to find out if that assumption is valid, and whether or not we're allowed to turn that into a fact? And then from that, make a decision that would lead to either a sequel, in other words, our plan is going according to the way we want it to, so we can continue, or a branch. Our plan is not going according to the way we envisioned it, and therefore we need to alter our plan and our execution. That collection plan will often be implemented through military intelligence specialists, such as Dr. Brand, that you'll hear from shortly. They would be tasked with looking at and monitoring particular elements of information that commanders need to determine whether or not a branch or a sequel is the next phase of what needs to happen. The best plans are not those that are time bound, meaning a plan that is designed to unfold at a particular date. Plans should be event driven. In other words, they should be responsive to real world events, not arbitrary deadlines. And so it's clear that in the situation in Afghanistan, that that military decision-making process did not unfold in a meaningful or recognizable manner. The criteria upon which the entire withdrawal hinged was how well the Afghan security forces would withstand in the face of the Taliban advance. We knew It's clear that the Taliban would advance. The only question was how quickly and how far. I won't go into too much detail on how we know that that is the case, but from phone calls and communications from the United States to those in power in Afghanistan and around the world, it was pretty clear that that was the criteria that was most on the minds of those around. And in a matter of 10 days, the Taliban advanced much further than anybody probably would have expected. And I say that based on the evidence of the employment of two national level capabilities that we are reticent to use. We've got them available to us as the United States, and it's good that we do, but we don't ever deliberately plan to use them. These are crisis response forces, if you will. The first is the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, and this is essentially a contract between the United States government and several air carriers, airlines and things of that nature, whereby we can take their aircraft and use them for our purposes when necessary. The design for the Civil Reserve Air Fleet was implemented back in the 1950s. It's only been implemented 3 times, and the third was here in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It is a very, very reactive capability. The second national level capability that I'll point to as evidence that the plan was not followed or not well built or crafted was the employment of the 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Bragg. This is the Global Response Force. These are troops that are ready to go in very, very short order, and they have expertise in securing and holding and operating airfields. In the case of Kabul, we ended up deploying the 82nd Airborne, at least 1 battalion out of the Global Response Force, which is evidence further that frankly, we were not in a position where we held the initiative in Afghanistan when it came to the withdrawal. Coming toward the end of my remarks, I would only comment that leaders are responsible for providing 3 things: hope, clarity, and the conditions for success. It's clear in this case that the Biden administration did have some handle on providing hope. There were many who wanted to be out of Afghanistan and wanted to see the United States involvement there come to an end. The deadlines that were established did provide that. I'll argue, however, that they were much less helpful when it came to clarity. The arbitrary establishment slipping from the Trump administration's deadline of May to September 11th initially, and then backing that up to August 31st was arbitrary and creates planning challenges for everyone involved, not just the United States, but our allies. And then finally, setting the conditions. This is a policy issue that I think is pretty clear was not done well. We chose to rely on Taliban forces for the outer security in around the Kabul airport. The argument was made that we had shared interest. The Taliban wanted us out of Afghanistan, and we wanted to get out of Afghanistan. Therefore, it was appropriate to trust them with the outer ring of security around the airfield. I would argue that they were not, in fact, trustworthy. Trust is a combination of character and competence. And even if we did have shared interest, if they didn't have the competence to secure the outer area around the airfield, it's irrelevant how much our interests are aligned. And just the approach and departure corridors, the defensive tactics that had to be employed as the evacuations were underway is clear evidence that the Taliban did not, in fact, have outer security in and around the Kabul airport. And we failed to employ the 82nd in one of their most capable mission sets, and that is the security and operation of an airfield. For those reasons, I give pretty low marks when it comes to the administration's leadership as the withdrawal from Afghanistan is underway. I think you can tell that all of our panelists have some pretty strong feelings about Afghanistan and how it unfolded. There are very real costs that were incurred by the nation. And if you'll give me just a moment, I will share some of those costs. On the left side of the screen right now, you'll see an image of Major David Gray with his wife Heather and their children. David was an airman employed as a tactical air control party airman. This is someone who is an Air Force officer who is designed to be and trained to be embedded with an Army or Marine Corps unit on the ground to help employ air power effectively in a tactical environment. On the right-hand side, you'll see Captain David Lyon, who's a 2008 graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, with his wife, Captain Dana Lyon, who's a 2006 graduate of the Academy. They were both deployed to Afghanistan in 2013, and you might note in the background there, there's some festive gear being worn. This is Christmas Day, 2013. Just within a very short period of time, far too short. Again, that's Major Gray on the left, and that is Captain Lyon as the escort officer for her husband's remains as he's being returned and repatriated to the United States. The costs of this war will last a lifetime and into the next generation. For these two families, this is not an academic topic. These are friends. So these stories matter a great deal to many of us. I know we have some additional reflections on that matter specifically. And so with that, I will hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Steele Brand.
Thank you, President Gibson. So my topic is entitled, it's a powerful segue from President Gibson's remarks, reflecting on death, defeat, and disgrace. As an intelligence officer who deployed to Afghanistan, I saw some of the good that we achieved. Terrorists were punished and those who harbored them. A safer strategic area was created, and the US gained streams of intelligence about terrorists. Tyrants no longer ruled, and a constitutional government that was flawed but more just emerged. Schools proliferated, including schools for girls. The quality of life improved. Just one example, and this is a powerful example, is that infant mortality was cut in half. However, I also saw the bad, and we've talked about that a little bit already today. We did not really know the history of the people. We didn't remember our own history in places like Vietnam. We threw too much money at too much corruption. And then we started violating military logic. We set timelines for withdrawal. Generals and colonels manipulated statistics to make it look like we were doing better than we actually were. Most importantly, we forgot what the meaning of victory is: crushing your enemy's will to fight. We didn't do that, and our enemies were emboldened. That was the good and the bad. This year, we saw the ugly. Despite all the promises to the contrary, a full-blown retreat unraveled that was neither safe nor orderly. Afghans desperately handing children over concertina wire or scrambling to get in planes taking flight. Another terrorist attack with the loss of 13 more American servicemen and women. And then there was a counterstrike where bad intelligence and worse decision-making led to the United States killing an aid worker and children. The Taliban took over. The tyranny returned. The US reputation was ruined. These headlines show that. Why would our allies trust us? Why should the world? Now, I'm not going to offer any what-if scenarios or anything like that. I'm accepting that the deaths, the defeat, and the disgrace have happened. They cannot be erased. So what do we do with questions like this one in the headline? Did the troops, or we could say, did the Afghans who were killed there die in vain? To answer this, like a good historian, I'm going to offer some reflections from two Romans who experienced failure in war, Cicero and Augustine. Now, not only did these two men write about failure in war, they both eventually died in the wars they wrote about. I should mention from the beginning that Cicero and Augustine are both indebted to Plato, who also wrote in the aftermath of a defeat. Here's a map indicating their experiences with defeat in war. Plato's mentor Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian War and witnessed Athens' defeat. When Socrates challenged Athens for its mistakes, Athens executed him. Behind Plato's writings are the war deaths of thousands of Greeks and the execution of the wisest citizen ever to walk Athens' streets. In his writings, Plato hints at the futility of restoring the ethos of the old Greek polis. It's quite tragic, actually. Instead, he actually sought to order a different kind of polis, that of the human soul. Plato's fundamental question is this: how do we work through defeat to seek wisdom, order our souls, and begin to achieve justice? Only souls of citizens who are wise, ordered, and just have the ability to win wars. Cicero experienced an even more excruciating defeat. After a lifetime dedicated to serving the Roman Republic, he was on the losing side of a civil war that saw Julius Caesar crush Republican forces and kill its leading statesmen. In 44, that republic was in tatters, and Cicero turned to philosophy for guidance, writing On Duties. Now, the book On Duties is not some obscure academic treatise written by an ivory tower scholar. It's an intense search from a statesman trying to discover how he can restore his republic. Why do we fight wars? Cicero asked. We do not fight them for glory or merely for strategic influence. The only excuse, he argued, for going to war is that we may live in peace unharmed. And how does a republic achieve this kind of virtue and success in war? Cicero said republics must return to the very basics of society: strong families with parents teaching children how to be good. Cicero writes, the first bond of union is that between husband and wife, the next between parents and children, and then we find one home with everything in common. This is the foundation of civil government, the nursery, as it were, of the state. Other family connections follow, and then friendships. Friendships in republics must be based on virtue, not pleasure or utility. The best bond of friendship is good character. These kinds of relationships that inform business and other social interactions where exchanges do not create a bond unless it is accompanied by a spirit of equality and a shared integrity. A country binds all of these things together, and if it truly does so, it becomes an object worthy of the most devotion. You love your country because it's the place that contains all of these loves: family, friends, and how you provide a living. He wrote this: parents are dear, dear are children, relatives, friends, but one's native land embraces all our loves. And who that is true would hesitate to give his life for her, if by his death he could render her a service? Republics based on these things win wars. They achieve peace because they teach people how to use courage. Courage to do evil things is not a virtue. Courage is only virtuous if it fights for virtuous things, writes Cicero. So we demand that men who are courageous and high-souled shall at the same time be good and straightforward, lovers of truth, foes to deception. For these qualities are the center, the soul of justice. Cicero would have looked on America's woes and readily identified several problems. We increasingly undermine or attack the natural family. We see citizens as atomized individuals connected to each other merely by a state that has no public faith, no binding set of ideas, no public life of the spirit. Friendships are not based on virtue, but on whether or not someone is vaccinated. We use courage to express ourselves as individuals, but not to serve other people. This is why less than 0.5% of citizens serve in the military, and voters repeatedly list America's wars at the bottom of the reasons they cast votes. What does America owe the world? What do Americans believe in? What are Americans willing to fight, kill, and die for? We do not agree on these things. Of course we can't win wars. We're too busy burning and attacking civic buildings at home. Now to Augustine. Augustine ended his life as the Roman Empire came crashing down. Barbarian armies were breaking through the gates of Roman cities, including Augustine's own city of Hippo, a signal event that the Roman Empire was nearing its end when the city of Rome was captured and sacked, an event that had not occurred in 800 years. Reflecting on this, Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, preached a sermon to his bewildered and fearful fellow Romans. He argued that national defeat and disgrace should prompt humility from individual citizens. Augustine reflects on the Old Testament figure of Daniel, who saw his people conquered and carried into captivity despite his own personal innocence. Nonetheless, Daniel humbles himself and confesses his sins. In the midst of failure, both the unjust and the just should be broken. Wouldn't anyone's pride then be shaken? Anyone's self-importance collapse? Wouldn't anyone feel his arrogance and conceit being checked? In defeat, a people must humble themselves. He then turns to the specific acts mentioned in the sack of Rome: slaughter, arson, looting, murder, torture. How do we cope with this kind of suffering? Augustine, who knew some of those who had been through the travails of the sack, saw these destructions, tortures, and deaths, and said they should prompt us to remember and rejoice. We are not physical creatures only. In suffering, a people must remember we are more than body. We have a soul. Our ability to reason, our seeking for deeper answers in the universe, our goal to be more perfect or better are all evidence of the truth that we are not only matter. For those that have died, their souls have already been freed from the pains here on earth. For those who remain, moral courage is needed. Power over what you suffer, he said, is not yours. You're human. What is yours is the will and what you do, whether it is guilty or innocent. What is our will at this moment? Augustine concludes his sermon by teaching that defeat, death, and disgrace should prompt acts of national repentance. Earlier, he spoke of individual humility. Now he talks about communal humility regarding earthly power. The Lord demonstrates how unsteady and fragile are all the world's trivialities. Augustine cites a recent incident in Constantinople and the biblical account of Nineveh's repentance after the warning from Jonah as examples of how any people have to take their failures seriously and acknowledge they do not create the cosmos or rule it. Instead, we are dependent on the Creator. Weigh Rome against Christ, he writes. Weigh the whole earth against Christ. Weigh heaven and earth against Christ. No creature balances its creator. No handiwork bears comparison with its craftsman. The cosmos, the earthly order, the perfection we seek here cannot be determined by human hands. In failure, a people must remember this more than ever and be chastened. If not, then they are condemned to further failures. Some closing thoughts. Drawing from the just war theory begun by Cicero, I think Augustine would have agreed that the war in Afghanistan was a just cause. However, America's attempt to create a world cosmos of the liberal democratic nation-state system was something else entirely. It was an old attempt at making a single unified political order. There is no human world order, and there never will be. There are only histories of peoples. We failed in Afghanistan because we failed to understand the histories of the people there. We also tried to make our American story their story in an act of national hubris. Then, because we are finite and fallible, we lacked the courage and the consistency to finish the job. We betrayed ourselves and our allies with our withdrawal. Were the deaths, the defeat, the disgrace all in vain? That is up to us right now. If we do not return to the fundamentals like family, character, and piety that make strong republics, they were indeed in vain. If we do not love our country enough to fight for it and serve others, then it was in vain. If we do not humble ourselves in this moment of national failure, then it was in vain. If we do not see that we are more than physical bodies, that we are rational creatures with a soul made in the image of a creator, and then humble ourselves as a people before that creator, then it was all indeed in vain. Now I'll turn the mic back over to Dr. Griffith.
Wow. Thank you to my colleagues for a powerful set of talks, thought-provoking panel so far. Let's turn to questions and answers from the audience and from myself. Let's start with a broad question. Perhaps all the panelists could weigh in if they'd like. What can we expect? The United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan. Is the global war on terror over? And if not, what can we expect the war on terror to look like in the coming years? What can we expect from our over-the-horizon technology? How sophisticated is Al-Qaeda? Do they have the capability now? Do you expect them to have the capability in the future to be able to attack our cybersecurity? And to what extent is the United States vulnerable to terrorist attacks in the future? So broadly, what might the war on terror look like in the future? And if you want to take up on any of those subthreads, feel free to do so. Dr. Habeck, maybe we can start with you. You could take it in any direction you'd like.
Thank you. So my response again goes back to the enemy that we're actually confronting. I mean, if it were the Taliban from, let's say, 1996 or 97 or something like that, then we could expect them to open up camps, invite in jihadists, and begin supporting indirectly the sorts of things that led directly to, however, 9/11. But they are not the same group that they were back in the 1990s. They've in fact melded with Al-Qaeda. They've adopted their form of Islam as Al-Qaeda has adopted their form of Islam. The two have become one thing. And the result is that we have really empowered Al-Qaeda by empowering the Taliban. So what is Al-Qaeda up to? Well, in the 1990s, and actually for a lot of the time during the 2000s, we believed we were dealing with a terrorist group. I've never believed that. We're dealing with an insurgent group whose military political methodology is predicated on Mao and Jop explicitly. And they've adopted Maoist or Jopist categories for the war they're fighting, beginning with terrorism, but working their way through irregular warfare of a higher sort, that is guerrilla warfare. And as we saw in Afghanistan, the capacity, the capability to carry out effective regular warfare and take territory in cities as well. My expectation is what one of the Taliban said, perhaps an Al-Qaeda member. He was identified as Taliban, but it's very difficult to separate the two these days. What do you intend to do next? He was asked. He said, we're going to attack Pakistan. And after that, well, we believe the entire world should follow our form of Islam.
Joe, I'll jump into the question just a bit, only to say, is the global war on terror over? Certainly not. Partly because the actors that would operate against U.S. interests are so varied and amorphous in many cases. And you heard Dr. Brand mention just war theory. This is not something that they agree with, nor is it something that they would implement in the same way that we might. Hence the attack on the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, more than 3,000 casualties, far and away, the bulk of those were civilians. And the rationale in their minds was simply they fund, they're taxpayers, therefore, they're part of the United States, the great Satan, therefore they're legitimate targets. So it's very challenging to ever say that we would be completely safe from an opponent who, or an adversary who thinks along those terms.
Yeah, I think that Al-Qaeda has launched several successful attacks in Europe since 9/11. I mean, in London, Paris, Madrid, Brussels. And I would expect that to continue and the rate of those attacks to intensify.
Dr. Griffith, I don't feel like I need to weigh in on that. I think the other panelists have answered the question really well. I mean, as you can tell, the thing I'm really concerned about is what kind of warfighting capabilities are we creating at home? And that starts with what's the spirit that's animating us. And that's where I'm deeply fearful of what America has the ability to achieve, because I'm not sure how much we want to win a war on terror in the way that perhaps we used to think of doing.
Excellent, thank you. Let's turn to the implication that the withdrawal has on the rest of the world. What will the effects of America's withdrawal be on especially the regions of Central and South China? How does this affect our ability to defend our national interests, perhaps especially as it relates to the defense of Taiwan, if necessary? As you know, Beijing has sent military aircraft into Taiwanese airspace as of late. When commemorating the withdrawal, President Joseph Biden declared that the world is changing. We are engaged in a serious competition with China, and there's nothing China or Russia would want more in this competition than the United States to be bogged down in another decade in Afghanistan. Is he right? How does this affect our ability to prosecute our national interests in the rest of the world? Oh, excuse me, real quick, in case you need this number again, feel free to text questions to 646-355-8946. Dr. Habeck, maybe we can start with you again. How does this affect our ability to prosecute our national interests elsewhere around the globe?
So over the past 10 years, ever since a decision was made to begin withdrawing from Afghanistan and Iraq, and also to shift our focus, to do a pivot to Asia, as people used to say, and to focus on what everybody liked to call great power competition. There has been this kind of argument that's being made that we need to focus on existential threats instead of these wars of choice, which I think panelists have argued is not, in fact, what we confronted in Afghanistan. And so people are saying we need to focus, for instance, on China. It's a much bigger and existential threat, nuclear armed country that apparently doesn't have our views about the use of nuclear weapons that we do. And I say the closest analogy or war in the head that I would give to the current situation is the 1930s, when we were confronting not one threat that we could simply focus on to the exclusion of all the others, but in fact, multiple threats that we had to take seriously and be able to, as I like to tell people, chew gum and walk at the same time. So I don't believe we should be ignoring China or downplaying the problems that it's causing. They certainly have not. Immediately after the withdrawal became the kind of chaotic event that it became, the CCP put out an editorial officially threatening Taiwan and saying, take a look at what's going on in Afghanistan right now. Is America really the ally that you want to depend on? Are they really the kind of people who will come to your aid? They literally put out an op-ed saying that immediately after we withdrew. So we have become the kind of person who doesn't apparently deserve that kind of high trust that Dr. Brand was talking about. But more than that, we believe we need to focus on things like the threat from China while ignoring what's really going on in other places like Iran, Afghanistan, and with Russia.
Yes, I mean, I hear a lot of talk about, it's almost like we can ignore these little small countries. We're going to focus on the big countries because that's what we do best. But I agree with you that China has really taken this opportunity to flex its muscles and threaten Taiwan. Taiwan is a thorn in China's side because Taiwan is demonstrating to the world that democracy works, that free enterprise works, that free press works. And this is something that China cannot abide. I mean, they crushed it in Hong Kong, and they would really like to crush it in Taiwan as well. And they see the United States as a country that does not have resolve. And that's making the world a more dangerous place.
President Gibson, there are a few questions that I would like to direct towards you about the withdrawal last month. You mentioned that our assumption was that, or the question that we had was how well the Afghan forces, the Afghan National Army, would be able to withstand the advance by the Taliban. Why were our assumptions, why did we not have better facts? Why did we not understand the situation better? To what extent was former President Donald Trump's deal with the Taliban, to what extent was that at fault? And to what extent was the decision-making at the top in August of 2021 with President Biden, to what extent was he at fault?
Yeah, those are difficult questions to answer definitively. Why didn't we have better facts? Well, we had facts. We certainly saw how quickly the Taliban was advancing. The question was, did we have adequate resolve and plans in place to either slow that advance or react appropriately in the face of it? And that's what I will assert we didn't do. To a large degree, our withdrawal from Afghanistan was our own choice. And as those weeks unfolded, even as the Taliban was advancing, they were blustering quite a bit, as if they had the ability to actually force us out against our will. And frankly, we played along with that in large measure. When I don't believe that we should have. There's plenty of capability that had we chosen to take more time, we certainly could have done so. Even the fact that President Trump established one deadline, President Biden established another, then President Biden changed that deadline, it gives us the insight that in reality, it was up to us. It wasn't up to the Taliban, and we didn't have to play along as if they were somehow equals in terms of national leadership. So I don't know that we didn't have the facts. I just think we were ill prepared to react to the facts on the ground.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Habeck, Dr. Brand, you all both mentioned the war in Vietnam. Why is the war in Vietnam a good or bad analogy for the recent war in Afghanistan?
I'm actually teaching a class for Yale alums called Wars in the Head, which is an explicit comparison of how people have talked about Vietnam and Afghanistan. But it's very common to use analogies of some sort to help us organize our thinking about warfare, the situation we're involved in, and therefore what kind of policies you should have going forward. And the point of the class is not to say don't use analogies because it's a bad idea. It's more use analogies, but be thoughtful about it and ask the right questions of the wars that you're looking at. So there are certain ways that Vietnam does indeed give us lessons for what went on in Afghanistan, absolutely. However, there are a whole set of things going on in Afghanistan that had nothing to do with what happened in Vietnam, and most especially the calculation of what would happen if we withdrew from Afghanistan was predicated on what happened after we withdrew from Vietnam. Nothing happened after we withdrew from Vietnam. There was no sudden explosion of Vietnamese forces, conquering the world and carrying out attacks against America, lining itself up with Moscow and Beijing and deciding to become part of some sort of global war with communism, or, for communism, right? But that's not true of the situation we're dealing with when it comes to the Taliban. They have explicitly aligned themselves with Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is a global insurgent group attempting to create a global jihad, of which the Taliban are supposedly in charge. Well, certainly they've got their own guy, up there steering events as well in Kabul. So this particular piece of the analogy was incredibly dangerous and led to a whole series of miscalculations about withdrawal.
Yeah, I think Dr. Habeck's got it right. Vietnam became the analogy for Afghanistan. It did not need to be the analogy for Afghanistan. And it was the method in which we departed that has created Saigon Part 2. Those comparisons are accurate now. It didn't need to be that way. It was a choice we made. It was a bad choice. Now, the difference, a really, really big difference, and this is what I fear, is that the sense of humiliation, the frustration, the shock at what has happened that occurred in the 70s, that lingered long, I mean, long. I fear it's going to be really, really short, as short as a tweet, in the American national memory. And that would be dire if that occurred.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. That's fascinating. Dr. Carle, what can we expect life to look like for the citizens of Afghanistan in the coming months and years, perhaps especially women in particular and Christians? Could you tell us what life might be like for them in the upcoming months and years?
Well, years, it would be hard to predict. I think in the coming months, the curtain has really come down. I mean, there were a lot of advances in the last 20 years that have been lost. Women are back under severe restrictions, almost house arrest in most of the country. And the Taliban, when they were in power in the 1990s, they persecuted viciously Shia Muslims and Christians as well. It's unclear how they're going to rule this time. I mean, I do think that they realize that that's a really dangerous thing for them to do. I mean, it inflames Iran, and it inflames their enemies in different parts of the world. But I'm pretty pessimistic about this current regime. I mean, the people that seem to be in place are the hardliners. So it seems like there is going to be a return to the situation in the 1990s, and they've already started implementing executions and corporal punishments that they were so notorious for in the 90s.
Thank you, Dr. Carle. Unfortunately, we have to conclude on that note, but I'd like to thank my distinguished colleagues for their powerful and thought-stimulating remarks. In particular, Dr. Carle for organizing this panel and for the King's College for hosting. It's been a pleasure to share this time with you. I hope you took, I learned things, and I have much to pray about in the coming weeks and months. Thank you. Good to see you.